Welcome to Gold Derby. I'm senior editor Denton Davidson here with Gerald Sullivan, production designer for the Whitney Houston biopic, I Want to Dance with Somebody. Gerald, what's something that surprised you the most about Whitney that you learned throughout this production?
I guess just how down to earth Whitney Houston was as a person. Um, we all know about her and her trials and travails and everything like that. But she was a really sort of down to earth person that I think got overwhelmed with the struggle of fame. So,
And we see several of her iconic music videos throughout this. How Will I Know? I Will Always Love You, for example. Can you talk about recreating iconic sets like that and how you pulled that off, particularly How Will I Know? Because that video is redone almost frame for frame. It's really fun to see.
right. So that's sort of like contemporary archaeology, where you do the research, you look at the video, and then we shot it from sort of like the fourth wall, where we were actually seeing the producers and the directors directing this video. So from the beginning, we sort of tried to decipher the plan of this set by watching the video over and over again, and then recreating it with our construction and scenic team on stage. And then we pull back and sort of guess at what the situation would be with the choreographers, the directors, the producers who would be in the sort of fourth wall area of this, and recreated it like that.
How long does that take to build, you know, one piece at a time? I'm always just so amazed at production design because there's so many elements that go into one little room. Every little book on the wall or splash of paint in a music video. What sort of attention to detail do you really have to dive into for these things?
Sure, we have to really look closely at like what are the materials that this was made of in that particular video. I imagine it was not a high budget video back then. We figured out a way to recreate that exact look with metal framing and a polyurethane translucent sheets that would go over this frame. We would have the frames scenic by our scenic team. So going into it, yeah, metal workers would be constructing the frames. We would have devised the plan for them to lay this out on. Our scenics would have the stage full of these polyurethane sheets and painting them on the floor, and then attaching them to the walls, painting the walls, recreating some of those sort of funhouse mirrors that appeared in that video as well. And then pulling it all together, and then taking one more step, backing up to where we thought the director would be, the camera would be, and how many cameras may have been used during this. And then looking at maybe the off-screen choreographers stressing out as people are dancing and so on. So yeah, that's sort of recreation.
And there's so many live performances throughout the film as well. What sort of research goes into those, and what resources were made available to you in that process?
Well, again, it's just sort of the research of the videos, maybe at times talking to a few people who actually did these videos, or were at these performances, whether the performance was in a music hall, and if it was, we're researching the architecture of the music hall and trying to get that right, and finding a location. We shot this in Boston, so we're using Boston's Opera House. Yeah, so we were using some of the larger stages that exist in Boston to supplement for what would have been the actual stages around the world that she used. For instance, the concert for South Africa, we used a massive hangar that's here in the suburbs of Boston, and recreated everything from about 40 feet down to the stage level. And then beyond that, we used set extension with visual effects. So all of the architecture that's on the stage, we build and set up and recreate that as expeditiously as we can. And then we work hand in hand with the VFX team to extend that set to be as large as it was.
Were you able to speak to friends or family throughout any of this? Like, did you get any insight from anyone that was personal to her?
Yes, her sister-in-law was intimate in helping us gather all sorts of small items that we would not have been able to get had we not had contact with the family. We actually used her actual road case, which is a case that's probably about 4 feet tall by 3 feet by 3 feet, and that's where her all of her vanity mirrors and combs and brushes and all of that. Her actual case was there, so that was very interesting to sort of open up. It's sort of like again contemporary archaeology, uh, Tutankhamun's tomb or something. It was pretty amazing, and people were a little bit awestruck to have her actual stuff there.
So everything inside that case was actually like her belongings of what she had on that last tour.
Absolutely. Yeah. Down to combs, hairs, wigs, everything. So,
Wow. And we talked about those iconic moments you recreate, but there's also many private moments. And it was fun to see her childhood home and the apartment that she and Robin lived in before she was famous. What goes into, a 70s house or an early 80s apartment, especially for someone that's a singer and it's a family of singers?
yeah. Well, for her family home, we did have a few photos and references, and we actually could go to Google Earth and look at the actual layout of the home on the block that it existed in. And from that, we scoured, the greater Boston area to find a house that matched as much as possible, and changed a bunch of things. Added a fence in front, added the red shutters that matched the house that she lived in. So it's a pretty complete mirror image of the house that she grew up in. For her apartment that she shared with Robin, there was no real existing photos that we could find. So we sort of imagined what you could get as a 19-year-old, and with very little means, and decorated that with some of her heroes on the wall and so on.
And as she becomes more wealthy, then the sets transform to these luxurious spaces and mansions. Is that more difficult or less difficult to create, or is that about equal? Is it just sort of different stuff?
Yeah, well, her mansion that she had in New Jersey was very, very unique, and if we could have shot there, I would have, because it's a plan made up of circular spaces. So we're not going to find that in the greater Boston area. So what we went for was a very high-end, the neoclassical house, which afforded us all of the grandeur that her actual house had. I think it's probably more difficult to try to recreate something like her 19-year-old apartment that she lived in, because there's really no evidence. And so you go on what you know about being a 19-year-old, and with all of your aspirations and wanting to be a singer and living with your friend, and what that would be like.
Of all the moments you created, what did you feel like was the biggest challenge for you, or biggest obstacle you had to overcome throughout the production?
Well, the Super Bowl at Tampa Stadium. Tampa Stadium obviously was demolished in the 90s. So again, it's looking at that stadium working hand in hand with VFX so that we could recreate that stadium all the way down to the scoreboard, or the ads that were on the scoreboard. And then using Gillette Stadium here in Boston to stand in for parts of that. So, football field is the same size in any stadium. So we have that going for us. And then again, just reviewing over and over again the video, or iconic video of that day, and working with VFX hand in hand to recreate that moment.
It's interesting that, part of the film takes place on the set of The Bodyguard. What's it like to create a set of a set?
Um, I guess tricky in a way because you want to capture it, but we also wanted to pull back a bit as well to show what the production would have been like as well. So that's always a little bit of a guess, but an educated guess because that's what we do. But yeah, that's a little bit challenging, yes.
Are things different for you when you're working on a biopic versus, you've been a part of some things like Grand Budapest Hotel or Dark Knight Rises, just totally different genres. What's different about a biopic, or is there for you?
It is different in a lot of ways. It's the same discipline. Again, you're trying to, create a great space or great spaces for the script in front of you. So in that regard, it's the same. I chose this because Whitney Houston was a big part of all of our upbringing. She was always in the background, and I'd never done a biopic before. So yeah, it's a total left turn as far as my career goes. It was fun as hell to do. It was challenging. But I would say the same disciplines apply. You're creating spaces, you're creating a palette within each space. In our situation, we were also traveling through about 30 years of time. So there's a period aspect to this all the way through, several different periods. So it's a great challenge.
Do you remember like at what era or time you sort of remember Whitney Houston being aware of her? At what moment do you remember her at her height?
Sure. Iconic How Will I Know video, MTV's first years. You couldn't turn on MTV without seeing that video again and again. So I think that sort of hits the nail on the head.
How did you decide you wanted to become a production designer? I mean, what leads someone into this field, and where did you get your beginnings?
Well, my background's architecture. I studied at SciArc in Los Angeles, and I went to school with a friend of mine who was actually Ed Sullivan's grandson. So he had the same last name as mine, and we became friends. He never had any intention of going into architecture. He was going into film. And I didn't know what the hell he was doing in architecture school. And so after school, he started art directing and did extremely well, started working on Hook and Dracula. And he would take me to those art departments that were filled with draftsmen drafting up scenery, just like architects drafting up their plans. And I found it extremely interesting and freeing. And so slowly segued from architecture into film.
And then you got hooked. Did he sort of introduce you to your first gig then, or what was your kind of first break on an actual set?
I took a job as an art department assistant at 30 years of age, and making $400 a week or something like that, doing sketches for the movie Judge Dredd way back. And I met a lot of people. I met a lot of extremely talented illustrators, and of course, Nigel Phelps, a very talented production designer. And through that, it sort of branched out into a network of folks. And I got into the union as a set designer and worked my way up that way.
Well, it sounds like everything worked out the way it was supposed to. Congratulations on this film. It's so much fun to watch and just hear that voice in a theater ringing through. And people watching this interview can go to goldderby.com, make your Oscar predictions, and check out more interviews with the year's top contenders. And Gerald, thanks for chatting about I Want to Dance with Somebody today.
Thanks so much for having me, Denton.